Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Andrew and Peter, for the invitation, and I want to thank you, your organization, for the incredibly important work that you're doing, and that is very precious to our work at AGC. I wanted to recall that. So I'll try to be brief and speak a little bit about France. So France's official position today on both the occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and on the recognition of an absolute right for statehood for Palestinians, is reflected in the oral statement that France gave at the court in January 2024. So as far as the occupation is concerned, France says that, in its opinion, the indefinitely prolonged nature of an occupation is contrary to the fact that it should be provisional in nature. However, occupation is a question of fact from which a specific legal regime arises. Its prolonged nature is not sufficient in itself to qualify as illegal. The danger would be that such a finding of illegality would lead to supporting the inapplicability of the regime. This would lead to a manifestly absurd and unreasonable result where civilian populations would be deprived of the protection offered by this regime, a protection that is all the more necessary when the occupation lasts in time. So it seems that here that France would not necessarily encourage such an adversary opinion, and as it was said earlier, France was among the states that didn't support the whole process of the ICJ engaging in such a procedure from the beginning. However, as we all know, if such an advisory opinion is decided, it could...
It's more comfortable.
Okay. We know that it could encourage to the imposition of more sanctions against Israel from UN member states. And as some of you may know, France recently decided on sanctions against violent settlers and declared being favorable of supporting similar sanctions at the EU level. So what we are fearing, and that hypothetically an ICJ advisory opinion on the illegality of occupation will only encourage this kind of initiatives to be taken more frequently. Now, as far as the Palestinian statehood is concerned, France says that, in fact, for France, only a political solution of two states will address the rights of Israelis to security and legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians to independent states, viable and contiguous, living in peace and security side by side with Israel. And to reach that goal, France calls on a decisive relaunch of the peace process. So just on this paragraph, for someone who's following France's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for many years, I would like just to point out some new ambiguity here, because up until now, the French language on that matter regularly referred to direct negotiations between the parties, and here it's not. Here, France refers to a political solution, which does not necessarily mean that this solution is negotiated first and foremost by the parties. France also refers to the relaunch of a peace process, which also doesn't necessarily mean that the relaunch itself will be decided by the parties. The process could also come or be imposed by outside actors like the international community, or as a result of an effort led by a third country, the United States or France, like it once did. Maybe some of you remember that in 2017, France organized a peace conference in Paris that was a total failure, a total disaster, and that up until now we understood that they knew that this was a failure and that they won't do it again, but we are not, it's not 100% sure, so let's see. And as you know, we are in a very unstable political landscape these days, so anything can happen depending on the government we will get on Sunday. So the main concern that the American Jewish community that I represent in France has is that the ICJ advisory opinion could lead to a situation where the terms of a political solution would be slightly different. If the ICJ determines that the Israeli occupation is illegal, it could change the paradigm, for sure, which the UN has repeatedly endorsed on how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Instead of a permanent status agreement achieved through negotiations between the parties, the new paradigm could be based on the notion that Israel should immediately and unconditionally end its illegal occupation, as it was already discussed, including East Jerusalem. Similarly, if Palestinians are recognized for having an absolute right to statehood, it means that the state of Palestine wouldn't be an object of negotiations anymore and could be declared by the Palestinians and recognized by nations unilaterally, like it's already the case, as we know. Some nations, especially in Europe, some UN bodies have already decided to take that direction. Up until now, it's not the case of France. France has not and does not intend to recognize the Palestinian state unilaterally. However, the rhetorics have evolved over time, and there's also more and more ambiguity, and it differed from one French government to another. So President Sarkozy in 2007 declared that peace would only be achieved through the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in security next to Israel. But we thought at the time, because other than that he had pro-Israeli positions, that he wouldn't favor unilateral steps towards the creation of such a state. However, in 2011, it's under his presidency that Palestine became a member of UNESCO, and France supported that at the time. Then during his campaign, President François Hollande declared the recognition of a Palestinian state as a campaign promise, but it's a promise that he actually didn't keep. In 2014, the French parliament voted in favor of a resolution calling for the creation of a Palestinian state that was supported by most of the MPs of François Hollande party, the Socialist Party. But it was not recognized under President François Hollande. And so as far as President Macron is concerned, the most recent position of the French government was a little ambiguous. After Spain and Norway recognized the state of Palestine, France was under European pressure, but mostly under the pressure of a political debate in France during the European elections campaign. As you know, the radical left party in France, La France Insoumise, put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the heart of their campaign. So at the time, France decided to vote in favor of the UN Security Council resolution drafted by Algeria, again, and calling for the state of Palestine's full membership at the UN. And then the French government kind of backtracked through declarations of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Stéphane Séjourné. He recalled the official position of the president, which basically states that the recognition of a Palestinian state is not a taboo, that France would be ready to go for it, but at the right timing, meaning in a context where it would be helpful, in a context of a relaunch of a political peace process. He added that such an issue must not be politicized and must be seen as a solution. And I referred to one of our speakers this morning, is it really a solution or a proposal? And actually, IGC Paris at the time, we called out the comment by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, referring to France's positive vote at the UN Security Council on a resolution that was actually all political and certainly not part of a solution effort. So what can we do to counter the narrative? Very briefly, we will recall to the French government that because they acknowledge it and they view it as the only basis up until now, that the only valid legal framework between the Israelis and the Palestinians remains the Oslo Agreement, the source of authority for the existence of Palestinian institutions of governance. The interim agreement established that neither side shall initiate to take any step that will change the status of the West Bank pending the outcome of the permanent status negotiations, that any attempt to prejudge the outcome of such negotiations, such as using the ICJ advisory opinion procedures, jeopardizes the prospects of peace, and in fact could remove the basis for the existence of the Palestinian Authority. By recalling that, we want to show the French government that the ICJ interference in the conflict will only politicize the court, detracting from its reputation as an impartial judicial body. Last but not least, if President Macron remains in power, I will be happy to answer any question you have about the elections. He's known to be a solution-driven, pragmatic political man. He wants to be seen as an honest broker in the peace efforts in the Middle East. And as ICJ advisory opinions unfold, it will be important overall to tell the French government that ultimately, and they know it, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not be resolved in a courtroom, but in negotiations between the parties. However, for years, the Palestinian leadership has refused to rejoin talks with Israel unless the latter made pre-negotiations concessions. With the Palestinians declining to actually negotiate, it's unacceptable that they would claim the absence of progress in peace process as justification for unilateral actions at the International Court of Justice or at the UN. This is contrary to pragmatism and this is contrary to an honest approach to peace negotiations. So in conclusion, today more than ever, it's quite difficult to forecast what will be the French position given our current situation. And it can take any direction depending on the political coloration of our future government. And I will be happy to answer questions on that. I will stop.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.